Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of a novel review, a book podcast. If you have read the title of the episode, you probably know that I'm going to be talking about Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, Book 3, The Sword of the Lictor, which is my monthly fantasy book. I have done the first two books already in the previous 2 months, so go check them out if you are interested. And yeah, today's going to be about The Sword of the Lictor, and it is a really interesting story. I think that's probably going to be the word of the day, very interesting. The first two books have been incredibly interesting in a very confusing kind of way. So I'm going to be speaking about that today. But first, before I get into that, I just want to say thanks so much for clicking on. I really do appreciate it. If you would like to like and subscribe, I'd also greatly appreciate that. But as always, it's just a free book podcast. So sit back and enjoy the show. Okay, let's get into it. Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, Book 3, The Sword of the Lictor. Really interesting book, really confusing book. Well, I think on the surface level, it's actually the entire story of the first two books, including the first two books and including this one, the third book. The surface level story is relatively easy to follow. I think I've mentioned that before. The surface level story is pretty easy to follow, and for that reason, it just feels like sort of a journeyman's adventure quest kind of thing. But there is a whole lot going on underneath the surface that really sort of makes this story what it is. And really makes it super confusing, but also adds this wonderful element, this wonderful depth to the story that it just always sort of feels a little bit out of reach. That's not to say it's bad. That's not a criticism of the book. That sort of really makes it this great Easter egg hunt. I saw this great comment, actually. It's like trying to fish in dark water. Reading these books, it's like trying to fish in dark water, and I'd probably add a bit more and saying it's trying to fish in dark water at night with the moon high and full, and it's just sort of shining on the water, and you just see moments of glints of silver as the fish sort of pass through the light. And you just see those very quick flecks of silver in the water, and you just kind of know something's there, but you just can't quite grasp it. You can't quite get at it. And that's what reading this book is like. So it is really fun to read, sometimes a bit frustrating because you can sense that there's something there, and you just don't quite know what it is, but still it makes for a really great reading experience. So I've got my notes here, full page of notes. The notes are as chaotic as you're trying to read and make sense of this story. I've already spoken about that. This third book, each book has felt a little bit different than the last, and this book was no different. This one felt very much like an adventure quest. It felt very picturesque. Severian, the main character, spends a lot of time in the mountains, which I really quite enjoy. I really like that about fantasy books, and it is probably my favorite aspect of fantasy books. It's the part where I feel most at home and enjoy the most. It's those really early stages of world building where the characters are sort of journeying through the country, and it's building the world around us. And I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and they actually really hate this part of a lot of stories, and it is an aspect that I think, it is a particular trope that I think a lot of people don't particularly like anymore, but I actually really enjoy it. I find it really comforting. And it also tells me that the writer himself or herself knows the world that they're writing about. And I think that's a really important part of a story, because if you want me to suspend belief and dive headfirst into a fantasy story, I need to know that you as the writer have control of this world and actually understand and know the world you're writing in. So those periods where we're sort of on the adventure through the hills, I always really enjoy it, because it sort of, I think, directly correlates to a really great story. That being said, that obviously normally happens very early in the story, not in the third book. So this was a little different, but it also just felt sort of homely and sort of felt like not a settling of the story, but it felt like it gave us a moment to breathe some fresh mountain air in this story, because it has been incredibly dense up until this point. And obviously the last book is going to be, I'm assuming, an absolute whirlwind, but it was a really nice part. It was artistically beautiful and really frustrating at the same time, because you just don't know what's going on, but really, really beautiful. And Gene Wolfe's writing is something to be revered as well. So seeing it in that context of something that I really enjoy in regards to fantasy writing, I thought was really, really good. In terms of story progression, this story actually felt like it progressed the most as well. Severian as a character really, I think, took some decent steps forward, and we saw some of the biggest changes we've seen towards or about Severian. He is a man that is very dutifully bound, and he really sort of respects his duty well, at least he says he respects his duty a lot, and that's sort of one of the things that I think forms a lot of his identity. And throughout the course of this story, he actually loses pretty much everything that he holds dear. And the first thing that he kind of loses is Dorcas, this character, and this character that's his lover. And she's been a really interesting character throughout the first two books. And she leaves relatively early in this third book for a couple of reasons, but one of them is because she is known as the lover of Severian, and he is perceived as this kind of, he's a torturer, so he brings death. And so a lot of people don't like her for associating with him. And so she steps away. She steps away for a few other reasons as well that I hope sort of get revealed and solved through the rest of the story. But the one that I kind of really resonated with was the fact that she associates with Severian, and that kind of makes her want to step away from him because she doesn't want to be associated with this torturer, this character that brings death. And I found that a really important one because she's directly stepping away, not because of Severian, the person, I feel, but because of, what he associates with. And that to me probably would have had an effect upon Severian's mental state. And he would have been like, oh, I'm losing, my lover because of this job that I have, and that forms a lot of my worldview and a lot of people's perceptions of me. So I found that one really interesting. He loses a few other things. He loses his job, which again just directly correlates to that, thing that he's really built his perception of, the perception of himself of. And there's a few more things which I might reveal through the episode. I might not, because they are relatively decent spoilers for the story, and I don't want to ruin it for anyone that's just listening to this episode who might read this, but he does lose a few more things that he holds really, really dear to himself. Something else that happens in this story that's really been building for quite a while, and we've seen glimpses of, is he doesn't just lose his job, but Severian also shifts to a much more compassionate person, and he sort of starts to help people a bit more. And it's sort of that coalescence of he's starting to help people more, and he loses his job and he loses his lover. And it's kind of this coalescence of losing so much of his, what he thinks his identity is in terms of being a torturer and killing people, losing them, combined with the compassion that he started to show. And it's kind of like all this loss that happens and accumulates in this book is, I think, actually going to lead to a bit of freedom for Severian, because at the end of this book, he's pretty much left with just himself, and he's lost nearly everything he held dear. So in that kind of loss, there is hopefully a lot of freedom for him now, and it'll be interesting to see how he progresses now into the fourth story of this book, the final book of the series, and see what character he actually is when he's freed of these kind of mental chains of duty that he's placed upon himself, and he's been raised into and through societal reasons as well. He was a torturer, and so that was like a really respected job, and he's formed his identity off that, which is completely fine. But now he's obviously separate from that. He's free of that, and so it's going to be really interesting, I think, to follow Severian on this final stage of this journey and see how he progresses as an individual. One of the things that I think has been really frustrating for me reading this book, wonderfully frustrating, is that it just feels so chaotic. It feels so utterly bewilderingly chaotic, that this story actually feels really concrete, and having those sort of solid losses along the way for Severian really feels like some genuine progress steps in this story, and it makes this story feel a lot more concrete. And it's just something I noticed, and I don't know if that's because it's the third book in the series and we need to sort of start to progress things a little faster and to wrap them up. I don't know, because I really have no idea where this story is going, and I have no idea how it's going to end. But that's okay for the moment. One of the best things about this series has been just the absolutely bafflingly weird amount of characters there are in this book. And there's been a lot of villains in this book that are also just creatures of literally pure fantasy, pure science fantasy. And one of them appears in this book, the Alzabo. And it's this being, and I kind of picture it as this like great big slob of a thing. When he's speaking about it, when Gene Wolfe's writing about it, I think it's just a wonderfully artistic piece of horror writing. It's a really sort of shining moment in this book, and it's really kind of masterfully told in that particular story. But it's this being that is this known as kind of like this creature, really destructive, and it consumes people. And when it consumes people, it consumes their memories, and can take on their memories. And I just found that really fascinating, because it's seen as this really evil, wicked character, but it kind of and Severian's really, not frightened by it, but he's obviously trying to avoid being consumed by this being. And I just found it really interesting because obviously in the second book, Severian consumed a piece of Thecla, who was, a previous lover or love interest of Severian, I should say, and he now occupies some of her memories in his mind. And I found it really interesting that there's kind of like that duality between this is a monster, this is some wicked creature that consumes people and takes their memories, but Severian's also done that, and it's kind of like that mirroring of those two. I don't know if there's going to be more about that or if I've missed something about that, but I just found it like this really interesting piece and passage of the story, and a really wonderful passage of horror writing from Gene Wolfe. But I also found it really interesting on a kind of outside the horoscope of just like that's kind of what we all are, kind of these Alzabos, in a sense that we all take on other people's memories and stories, and when we read novels and books, we are taking on these characters into our mind, and often they will, their thoughts, questions, concerns about the world might often infiltrate our own and influence our own and come out and start to shape us in a different way. And that's not necessarily limited to literature as well. That's just all life. Like, we're constantly taking on people's opinions and trying to shape ourselves, maybe based off those opinions, maybe not. In the picture of Dorian Gray, there's that wonderful quote. I can't quite remember it, but it's that wonderful passage where he's talking, it's Lord Henry, and he's talking about how if you take on someone else's opinion, you sort of like rob your own mind of its sort of machine-like faculties, and it robs that moment of being able to form your own opinion because you've now been influenced by someone else. And even if you go against that opinion, you've still denied yourself the organics of forming that opinion yourself. So yeah, I really love the Alzabo. I thought it was this really fascinatingly horrifying creature in the story, but just in the sort of the broader context of life, I found it like a really fascinating thing to be seen as this really wicked thing to steal people's, or to consume people and steal their memories at the same time, and just how what that sort of means in the context of reading stories and going through everyday life. So yeah, I just really enjoyed some of the creatures that are popping up, and the Alzabo was one that just really kind of stuck out for me quite vividly. What I find really interesting about this book, this series, is that we're coming into the last book now, and in a way the jury is still kind of out as to whether this is a great series. I know it's very well revered and respected, and everyone that loves it absolutely adores it, and it's got a huge fandom, but I'm coming to this fresh, and I'm allowed to have my own opinions. I have absolutely enjoyed the first 3 books, but obviously a lot now rests on the 4th book. We've kind of progressed. There's no real obvious linear journey, no destination, no thematic direction. At least I haven't really detected one. It's kind of angling towards this war that's been going on in the background, but it hasn't played a major part in the story. But again, I'm saying all this, and maybe I'm just missing half the story because it's so dense and such a foggy read. But the point I'm trying to make is it puts a fair amount of pressure now on the 4th book, and it's an interesting kind of pressure because it's not the kind of pressure where I know how the story is going to end. It's not like there's a lot of loose threads hanging around and it's all sort of got to be wrapped up really nicely in this tight little end that doesn't feel rushed, when often sometimes they do feel rushed. So because there's no obvious loose ends and I don't know where it's going, I guess it sort of relieves some of that pressure, but still the pressure's there to deliver this story. We've been in this story now for 3 books. We've got 1 more to go. I have an idea how I think it's going to end, but I'm going to keep that to myself. But yeah, it's just kind of, 1 book to go, bit of pressure on that book. How's it going to end? I'm not too sure. I do have an idea, but I think it's just the jury is still kind of out as to whether this is a great series in my mind. Obviously that's just my opinion, but it is just such a different kind of series that I've ever read, that I think it is going to be a great series no matter what. But I don't know, and I don't know how to really explain it because it's just so baffling. It's just so bewildering. It's just been such a different read, and not at all what I was expecting when I picked up these books for the first time. So I've really enjoyed the first 3 books. I definitely hope I'm going to enjoy the 4th book because everyone says the reread value of these books is just through the roof as well. Once you kind of have the whole picture, It makes the books really good, which I'm not opposed to either. I'm not often fazed by endings in a particular way. It is for me often about the journey that we take to get to the end. Obviously, if it's like a murder mystery and like the ending is, you know, a huge aspect of the story and sort of builds the tension through the story, that's completely different. But for stories like this, where it's kind of, you know, really going to end one way, he sort of lives or he dies, I'm not too fussed about knowing the ending, because I am more interested in the story and the journey to actually get to the end. And that to me is more important. So I don't mind sort of knowing the end. I don't know the end, of course. But the point is, yeah, I think once I have the whole picture, I think it's going to make the story a lot more better. So Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, Sword of the Lictor. What would I rate this? Probably my favorite. I think I've rated the others a 4.5 out of 5. So I'm going to rate this one a 4.6. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week I was reading Pefection by Vincenzo Latronico. It's published by Fitzcarraldo Editions, one of those wonderful blue books that you always see in the bookshop. Really, really interesting story. It's considered fiction. I don't even know if I would consider it fiction though, because it's really just kind of this story about this expat couple living in Berlin, trying to make sense of the modern world and sort of their place in it, and, you know, getting that external validation through social media and trying to live this perfect life. I mean, like I said, it's a fiction story, but it very much reads like an essay that's sort of commenting on a few of these things, a social essay that comments on a lot of these issues that maybe are presented as really good, but they're not actually that good, because if you're trying to live this life where you're getting external validation sourced through social media, you're probably not too happy. That's not saying everyone is, but that's sort of the vibe I'm getting from this book. So yeah, really, really enjoying it. I think it's, you know, quite an interesting commentary on the modern setting of life. So let's see where it goes. Pefection by Vincenzo Latronico. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I really do appreciate it. I hope you have enjoyed the show. If you would like to hear more, please like and subscribe. But as always, just thank you so much for making it to the end and for listening. So today, to take us away, I think the opening testimonial quote from Pefection, this kind of sums up what the story is about, and it's by George Perec. It says, "That was where real life was, the life they wanted to know, that they wanted to live."